Our two panelists today, Matthew Purlott, first, is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Westchester University. His research focuses on issues of agency and moral responsibility, and he teaches in ethics, including business ethics, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and on free will and agency. He has a special interest in labor outsourcing and exploitation, and has examined the topic in a few articles, including Moral Considerations in Outsourcing to Foreign Labor in the International Journal of Social Economics, and Sweatshops and Cynicism in Fashion, Philosophy for Everyone. Our second panelist is Morton Emmanuel Winston, Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion at the College of New Jersey. His areas of specialization include ethics and human rights theory, and he has published numerous articles in these and other areas. A three-time recipient of the Fulbright Scholarship, Professor Winston has also had a long career as a human rights activist, having served as chairman of the board of directors of Amnesty International USA. He has authored and edited several books, including Society, Ethics, and Technology, and is currently working on a conception of a global ethics that attempts to describe an ethical framework for a global moral community. Please join me in thanking, or welcoming, rather, our panelists.
Do you want to go first, or should
Doesn't matter to me.
I would rather go first.
Well, go ahead.
'Cause I never get to go first because of my. Is this on? Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm going first because I'm a W, and I never get to go first in these things. Sort of Matt's very kindly. Thank you, Alan, for organizing this. Thank you to the Rosemont College for hosting this very nice event. I'm very pleased and happy to be here. Thank Ron and the other speakers. I have some remarks that may seem like they ramble a bit, but they will intersect with what Ron, Duska, and some of the other speakers said earlier today. I promise to be brief. As Alan mentioned, I've been fortunate to have been the recipient of 3 Fulbright scholarships. About 12 years ago now, I had a Fulbright scholarship in Thailand, where I was teaching at one of the big 3 universities in Thailand, Mahidol University, in their graduate program. It was a wonderful experience. I had great colleagues and students from all over Southeast Asia. One of the things that really fascinated me about living in Thailand was that Thailand is a constitutional monarchy. The current king, and his name is His Royal Majesty Bhumibol Adulyadej, also known as Rama IX, is the longest-serving monarch in Thai history. And he's also currently the longest-serving monarch or head of state in the world. He's reigned since June 9th, 1946. He's loved and revered by his people, and his death will undoubtedly inaugurate a long period of national mourning. The king's high reputation in Thailand is protected in part by lèse-majesté laws. It is illegal in Thailand to criticize the king, the royal family, the king's projects, or past Thai kings. If you do that, you can spend up to 15 years in prison. One of the things one is permitted to say about His Majesty the King is that he is a living example of Buddhism's 10 royal virtues. So Lord Buddha taught that there were 10 essential virtues for rulers. The 10 are dana, which is charity, sila, self-control, parigagga, giving up, renunciation, ajava, straightness or rectitude, madhava, gentleness, tapa, perseverance, akoda, non-anger, avihimsa, not causing harm, khanti, endurance or patience, and aviradana, not doing wrong. In the ancient world, political philosophy was understood to be a branch of ethics. The basic idea that you find in both the Eastern and the Western traditions is that if you want to have a good government, make sure you have a virtuous ruler. One could also see the same basic idea in Plato's Republic, in which he argued that if an ideal city-state was ever to come into being, quote, philosophers must become kings, or those who we now call kings must genuinely and adequately philosophize. Aristotle and here's where I begin to intersect with Ron's remark, placed greater emphasis on the constitutional form of government. He distinguished three main kinds of government: government of the one, of the few, and of the many. And then he went on to describe the ideal and the perverted or corrupt forms that each of these can take. In the ideal forms, which he called royalty, aristocracy, and constitutional government, the rulers all aimed for the common good of society. In their degenerate or corrupt cousins, which he called tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, they all fail to achieve their purpose because they aim at the protection of special interests. The tyrant aims to protect his own power, the oligarchy aims to protect the rich, and democracy aims to protect only the poor. For Aristotle, the best form of government was a constitutional oligarchy led by what he called the best men, a kind of meritocratic elite of the wisest and most virtuous citizens who would steer the state on a steady course in the direction of the highest good, which is the common good. Now, there's an obvious analogy between government and corporate governance. The CEOs of today's multinational corporations are today's monarchs. Given the concentration of power at the top of most corporate management structures, CEOs wield enormous influence over the behavior of the companies that they lead. Ron Duska has spent many years arguing that given this fact, the key to corporate reform lies in ensuring that the men and women who become CEOs are indeed virtuous. The CEO is not only an executive, he or she also sets the moral tone for the company's culture by his or her personal example. The different ethical cultures that different companies have is largely a function of the moral example set by their founders and by the succeeding chief executives of the company. So those of you who are here this morning heard a wonderful talk by John Bogle. He's a living example of a virtuous CEO, a founder of an important company, who set the ethical tone of that company through his own example. But we have other cases. Let me talk about some other cases. You all remember a few weeks ago a very public letter of resignation from Goldman Sachs by a guy named Greg Smith. Greg cited as one of his reasons for leaving Goldman Sachs was that the fact that the traders routinely referred to their clients as Muppets. The next day, Stephen Colbert invited a real Muppet, Kermit the Frog, onto his show as a wry mockery of a corporate culture that thinks of its clients as sock puppets. Now, Greg Smith appears to be someone whose own personal moral character was out of alignment with the ethical culture of the company for which he was working. People obviously do have moral characters, but do companies? Aristotle described virtues and vices as habits or characteristic dispositions to act in certain ways. So human beings can be honest or dishonest, trustworthy or untrustworthy, compassionate or callous. But can we meaningfully apply these same terms of moral evaluation to corporations? The answer, I think, is probably yes, but only by analogy. So a few weeks ago, Mitt Romney, who you know is unemployed, but he's applying here for a job as an executive, he declared that, well, of course corporations are people. And I tried to figure out exactly what he could mean by that. There are a couple of readings where it's clearly not true. I mean, one reading is he was simply committing the fallacy of composition and mistakenly thinking that the corporation is equivalent to the sum of individuals who work for the corporation. That's just a fallacy. An even more uncharitable reading of that remark is to see that he was confusing corporations with natural persons like you and I. Corporations are not natural persons. They're not conscious. They have no sensory experiences. They have no feelings. They have no desires. They have no wishes, no regrets, no hopes, no fears. They also don't have any bodies, They don't eat or sleep. They don't have sex in order to reproduce. They're not born. They do not bleed. They're not alive. And they do not die. So what could he have meant? Well, when rational and sober people like Romney talk about corporate personhood, what they usually mean is that corporations are regarded as legal persons, in the sense that they're entities that are entitled to certain kinds of legal rights and responsibilities. For instance, to enter into contracts, to buy, own, and sell property, and obligations to pay taxes and obey the law. Corporate personhood is a convenient legal fiction that allows the government or the state to ascribe some of the rights and duties we ascribe to natural persons to these organizations. So one of the legal rights we ascribe to natural persons but not to corporations is citizenship, and concomitantly the right to vote. Corporations don't get to vote. Citizenship has two meanings. One is the basic meaning, moral status, membership in a particular political community. The other meaning is citizenship as a virtue, as the tendency to faithfully discharge your responsibilities as a citizen, your duties and obligations to society. So we have in recent years the rise of the corporate social responsibility movement, CSR. I've been part of that movement for many years. People in this movement have been arguing that corporations have social responsibilities, such as to respect human rights, to protect environmental quality, to avoid corruption, to protect the employee health and safety, many other specific duties and obligations. And as has been said before, many, many companies have embraced CSR and are now styling themselves as, quote, good corporate citizens. Every year, companies now publish these glossy corporate citizenship reports. I get one almost every day from a different company that's published their citizenship report. They're interesting reading. They're quite different. A lot of human rights activists who I know don't think that they're for real. They think of them as just slick public relations exercises. But I think I tell them that different corporations are actually different. They don't have the same moral cultures. Like people have different moral characters, corporations have different moral cultures. So some are really good companies and they act in the interest of society, where others are not so much good companies and they don't. So just think about it. The Jim Henson Company is not the same kind of company as Massey Energy. They have very different kinds of corporate characters, okay? Some companies out there are really, walking the corporate social responsibility walk, while others are just talking the social responsibility talk. Now, Philippa Foot, who's a philosopher I admire, had a very good essay on the virtues, in which she said the virtues function as correctives. She said, in humans, quote, it's only because fear and desire for pleasure operate as temptations that courage and temperance exist. For each virtue, she wrote, there is some temptation to be resisted or some deficiency of motivation to be made good. Now, something very much like this seems to me to apply to corporations. Different types of companies in different businesses have different types of temptations and deficiencies of motivation. So brokerage houses and banks are tempted to put their own interest in profit-making ahead of the interest in profit-making for their clients. Bogle talked about that this morning. Companies like Facebook and Google, who make their living selling personal information about their users to advertisers, are tempted to play fast and loose with people's private personal information. Chicken farmers are tempted to mistreat their poultry. Garment factory owners are tempted to exploit their workers. Oil and mining companies are tempted to leave the land despoiled after extracting its underground treasure. Now, for each of these kinds of corporate temptations, there should be a corrective virtue embedded in each corporate culture that would prevent the company from harming society in these types of ways. For natural persons like us, they take the form of habits or dispositions by which we self-regulate our behavior. By analogy, for corporations, they would have to be internal policies, or codes or guidelines that require their executives and CEOs fulfill their social responsibility. However, what are we to do about companies that possess neither virtuous CEOs nor social responsibility policies that are embedded into their corporate culture? In the absence of effective self-regulation, we need to have the rule of law that strictly obliges companies to fulfill their social responsibilities. So this is my central point, folks. Ethical leadership and corporate social responsibility are necessary, but they're not sufficient. In order to control these mammoth corporations, they must be subjected to the rule of law. Because of the failure of Wall Street executives to rein in the culture of casino capitalism, whether they believe that corporate self-regulation is reliable or sufficient. Efforts to impose new legal regulations on corporations to prevent their misbehavior are regularly defeated by their armies of lobbyists in Washington and every state capital. Corporations spend billions of dollars to ensure that politicians who will reliably protect their special interest in exchange for campaign donations are the ones who mostly get elected. And then they deploy armies of lawyers to defend themselves against tort suits or require consumers to sign binding arbitration clauses in order to get a loan or any contract. Citizens feel increasingly powerless and cynical about our ability to resist the forces of corporate domination over both the market and our public life. I think it's time that citizens, and here I mean people like you and I, take up our social responsibilities, stop acting like Muppets, and reclaim our democratic institutions. Unless we do this, our country will become a corporate oligarchy run by and for the plutocrats. In fact, many people, including myself, believe that it already is.
I have to follow that. I don't have prepared comments, but first I would like to thank Alan and Rosemont College for this. I've had a wonderful day. To follow on that, I'm glad you brought that up. Professor Winston made some points that are concerned to me. When we talk about virtues, we usually are thinking about individuals and how that individual shapes themselves, but the moral landscape is larger than just that. It should include that element, the individual who is forming good habits and self-regulating. But we know from real life that there are issues in which we have to deal with where someone has already failed to do that, and then what do we do in response? I kept on thinking to myself as we were going through the day with all the wonderful speakers and many of the themes that came up, that in earlier talks we heard about how there's a power in social expectation that oftentimes goes unnoticed or underrated. If I have the expectation that people should respect certain principles, that they should never even think that I would stoop to the level of not also recognizing those principles, then in our interactions, those principles are taken for granted. I'll assume that other people will respect me enough not to tempt me in a way. I would never even consider opening up the topic of tempting someone else to bend an ethical principle because we have enough mutual respect. But that requires a community, right? That requires us forming an ethical community, a community that values those principles, holds them up, enforces them. Throughout today, we've been talking about leaders, and we typically think of the paradigm of upper management, the CEO, the top-down leadership. And there's important reasons for that, because we know that power has an influence on us. So it is the example of someone who has power to fire me or promote me that's going to give me a lot of incentive, and is also going to, in some way, impress upon me psychologically that if this powerful person is upholding these principles, then I should too. But there are other forms of leadership besides that. There are other ways in which we can be called to leaders that, even if we are not in a position of that sort of power. And part of that leadership is an ethical leadership that is not related to one's position. That is that soul or that spirit to be able to stand up in a circumstance when someone's integrity is being called into question, or someone is asking you to give up some of your dignity, and to be able to say, I don't think that's appropriate to do to begin with, and holding one's ground. And one takes a risk when one does that. But that's another kind of leadership that we should have our attention to. I really appreciated Professor Duska's remarks, where Ron was talking about this loss of soul. And that's another element that has popped up throughout the discussions today that I also, through my teaching in ethics, over and over again, I've found to be essentially important, is this notion that our fundamental purpose and fundamental beliefs need to be recognized as a common good. And so when Ron brought up this notion of a common good, I'd like to expound a little bit more upon that notion. When we have a common good, it's something that all of us have an interest in. We all benefit from, and we all want to protect. So if you think of like a water reservoir, right? This water brings things to us. It's a good. Without it, we wouldn't be able to have the water in the same way. It would be more difficult. So this common good, this public good, we all share an interest in preserving. Well, beliefs and principles can also be common goods. There's certain ideas that can be fundamental to the fabric of our community. In a paper that Ron had shared before to sort of prepare for today, what he might be speaking about today, he had mentioned some of the failures of the moral principle, or the moral theories that we call liberal moral theories, theories that allow for the individual the freedom to decide the individuals to decide their own purposes, right? So if I can express my own views. And while that's important, and we certainly want to respect people's freedoms, there are other beliefs that I think we need to recognize are not up to people's opinions. Certainly when we think of our own government, the Constitution seems to be one of these founding documents that everyone ought to believe in. The principles that are and the ideas that are laid out in that document. And so I think when we start talking about ethical leadership, one part of our discussion should be to identify what are the beliefs in a certain company that form the cohesion of that company, that allow it to do its good, whatever its good can be. And who are the people who enforce that belief? Because I don't believe it's just going to be the CEO. I think the more that you can have a company or an organization of any type that can solidify around certain fundamental beliefs, values, then there are multiple options for leadership, multiple opportunities for leadership emerge that are not just restricted to those who have certain offices. So that kind of connects to what Professor Winston was just speaking about, because as a nation, as a society, we also have certain responsibilities. And if an organization is not going to self-regulate, then we have to come in to regulate. Milton Friedman was brought up, and the trouble with Friedman is not just that there's this advocation of the maximization of profit, but also that Friedman in that article suggests that the company has no social obligation because, after all, there's no real expertise to attend to social responsibility. And then Friedman says it's really the job of the laws to do that, but we know in practice that there's a resistance to those laws. So if you really believe that the companies are profit engines and that it's the duty of the public to regulate them, then those profit engines should not be standing in the way of regulation. I'm not a wild advocate of regulation because it has its own inefficiencies, but it does seem like there's the double bind, right? Either there's going to be self-regulation or that's an invitation of external regulation. So.
Well, we have about 10 minutes in this session, so I'd invite anyone in the audience who'd like to pose some questions for either Professor Duska or the panelists. Please approach one of our two microphones.
My name is Helen McDevitt Smith, and one of my claims to fame is that I am a graduate of Rosemont College, 1963. When I was here, there were required courses in ethics, and I can remember a term used a lot, and it was the common good. I don't hear that term much in our political and economic sphere today. It was mentioned several times today, which really gratified me. Now, my question is, and I hope I don't get too political with this, but when I hear people talking about giving enormous tax breaks to those who are wealthy, it is said that that will trickle down to the poor, that also it will create more jobs, which will be beneficial to the poor. I'm beginning to get much, that kind of looks like it is for the common good, a policy like that. I'm getting to be very skeptical about that, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Let me jump into that. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread.
You take that.
I think the big issue for those of us in the ethics field is the political economic issue. And I see, and by the way, if to do justice to Milton Friedman, he does say within the law and the customs. So he's got no problem with the law and the customs, and that's a whole other issue. I guess if I could put it in ethical theoretical terms, I don't think there is enough looking at the consequences of the economic systems. And it's a huge argument, and I've come a long way since I've been doing business ethics, trying to figure out how to generate goods and services and how to generate wealth and that sort of stuff. And I see what's going on is, we've got on the one hand, and I bring up the deserving poor we've got on one hand the emphasis on social justice and the talking about social justice, and I do indeed think social justice is necessary. But the overriding question seems to me to be which economic system is going to bring the most wealth for the most people, and I think things like tax breaks and that are side issues. It really is that kind of an issue. I don't get excited about people riding in jet planes because people have to build the jet planes and people have to fly the jet planes, and one of my colleagues in business ethics, son, is a private pilot, and he's having problems finding jobs now because there aren't enough jet planes. I think it trickles down. I may be wrong, but I would like to see a serious discussion of that, because it's only if we generate more goods for the entire world, right, that we're going to be doing good. Otherwise, we're sitting on our ethical high horses. And I've labored too much with business people nowadays to sit on that high horse anymore. I don't know the answer to that. In terms of, I would argue that we have an oligarchy. I gave a talk once. I said an oligarchy, and somebody in the back says, nah. I said, nah? He said, what? No, we've got a kleptocracy. And that may be the case. I've got a lot of trouble with Goldman Sachs, but I've been up close with the legislation that Bogle mentioned about fee for services. And that's a power play too, because people running one set of designees are fighting with another set of designees because everybody wants to be top dog, and the insurance companies are fighting with the financial service people. And that's competition. It's competition. It's going to be there. It's going to be real. But it tends, because somebody wants to push their program more than somebody else wants to push their program, it tends to become self-interested. That's just, I think that's just life. So I don't know whether this is helping answer your question. I want to know which economic system, and I'm convinced it's some form of the free market system, although Bogle this morning was just awesome in showing how that separation of management and ownership and management has got to be an issue we've got to come to grips with. I guess I'd also like to say, I don't any longer see one corporate culture. I work too much with people at home offices and people in the fields and the secretarial pools and that sort of stuff to recognize that every corporation I know, at least the big ones, have about 20 cultures. And the word ethics comes from ethos. And they're the rules of the games by which you play. And so if you're in this area of the corporation and somebody's in that area of the corporation, you're going to have conflicts. I mean, that's the human. And you get caught, whose ethos am I going to listen to? So this is a big, long non-answer to your question, I think. Oh, one other point I wanted to make. I did a column on fiduciary responsibility because there is a paragraph. There's a paragraph in 2,400, I think it's 2,400 pages of the regulatory bill, what's the name of it, the Dodd-Frank bill. 2,400 pages. There's one paragraph that talks about fiduciary relationship. It empowers the SEC to set up a panel to study it. So when I decided to write the panel, or write the column, I had to go read the now 200-page report on whether or not to apply the fiduciary. So if you got 200-page reports coming on one paragraph of a regulation, I've got my doubts about regulations' effect. They should be simple, they should be direct, they should not be put, and I really do think we ought to have a rule that makes everybody who's going to pass it read it.
To ask, and I don't quite know how to put it, the gentleman in the middle who gave his comment said that he felt that we're at a place that is of great concern, which I agree. But how do we get out of that place if issues keep coming up that would support getting out of that place and nobody wants to support them? For example, the campaign contributions or any one of the other zillion that might begin to force ethics to come to place. Get rid of the lobbyists, get rid of and people have brought that up, but it doesn't go anywhere. Where are we going with that?
All right, that's a great question. I think there are some hopeful signs. So there are some new channels for citizen power to be exercised over these enormous corporations. So just remember, a few months ago, Bank of America said, oh, we're going to impose a fee on your debit card. What happened? Well, a woman in Virginia said, hey, no way am I doing that. She started a Facebook campaign. And within like 3 days, she had like 9 million people, agreeing with her. And what happened to Bank of America? Said, okay, sorry, didn't mean it. Okay? Just in the news this week, I saw a report about how the shareholders for Citigroup turned down a pay package for Vikram Pandit. Vikram was going to get $15 million in salary. And the shareholders said, no, we're not paying it. Okay? And I heard an interview on the NewsHour with a woman who represents CalPERS, which is the huge California pension fund, big institutional investor, and she said, well, we're a long-term investor. We don't see the long-term vision, we don't see the transparency that we're looking for, so we're not going to give him $15 million. So these are some of the new avenues through social media, through shareholder activism, shareholder resolutions, that citizens are trying to fight back a little bit and to put some constraints on these enormous corporate empires and to bring them under some sort of social control. I don't think it's enough, but I think there's some hopeful signs of that happening. What disappoints me, as you've mentioned, is that so many people seem so resigned to it. That's why I wanted to give these remarks. I don't think we should be resigned to it. I think we have to really take our social responsibilities here seriously. It's all well and good to talk about, admiring ethical leaders in business and promoting voluntary corporate social responsibility. I'm all for that. But we have to recognize that it's not enough. It doesn't deter the bad companies from doing bad things that hurt a lot of people. They're not going to be swayed by moral exhortation and by lectures on Aristotle. I'm sorry. You need the law to, require them to fulfill their social responsibilities. And as long as we're letting them control the lawmaking process, we are, going to be on the losing end of that proposition.
Please.
Two very quick questions for the panel. I really appreciate your remarks. I'd like to know if you've focused your attention at all on the so-called nonprofit business world, and if some of the same comments apply to that world. Secondly, I'd like to know if any of you are acquainted with Barry Schwartz's work on practical wisdom, which says the rules and incentives don't work very well for individuals. I don't know how they work for corporate entities.
I don't know about Barry Schwartz. On the nonprofits, I see the same temptation. I made a side remark about Notre Dame paying $12 million. They forget their purposes too. They really do forget their purposes. And faculties forget their purposes. And human beings end up being kind of self-interested. I remember one person of a nonprofit sitting telling his people, I sat there and listened to it, well, we've got to make a profit. What he meant is you got to be in the black. But there's a kind of a slip of the tongue there. And I find the nonprofits, I find them more disturbing when they lose their way than the for-profits. I find it a little bit more hypocritical. But I think we all need to look in our institutions and in ourselves at what our main goals should be, which would contribute to our betterment and the betterment of the common good. And, Protagoras would have been today's professor, right? And he lost his way. And I'm waiting for the academic bubble to burst, but that's just me.
So, some years ago I was head of the board of Amnesty International, and one of the things I did when I was chair was I established our Business and Human Rights group. It was one of the earlier groups, that was pushing for business social responsibility for human rights. We did reports, we did guidelines, we did lots of things claiming that businesses have a social responsibility to respect human rights. It didn't seem like it was that radical, but there was a lot of pushback. So after a while, it occurred to me that, wait a minute, if we are saying as an NGO that these businesses have social responsibilities, then don't we too? So, I went to our leaders and said, well, look, you have to take seriously your own social responsibility as an organization. You're a corporation. You might be a nonprofit corporation, but you're a corporation too. So there's actually a very interesting report. There's an outfit in the UK called the One World Trust that for the past 5 or 6 years has been publishing something called the Global Accountability Report. And in this report, they evaluate for-profit businesses, mainly multinationals, against international NGOs and against intergovernmental agencies like UN agencies on a whole variety of CSR criteria. Stakeholder engagement, transparency, all of these things. And they do it very carefully in a comparative way. And what's interesting is that some of the for-profit companies do better than a lot of the NGOs. Okay? It's very interesting. So the NGOs I see as needing to play catch-up to a lot of the leading-edge corporations who are really on the CSR path in a serious way. They were the ones who got criticized in the media and had all this pressure to kind of clean up their act in the 90s. And a lot of those companies have turned a corner, have become much more responsible. But no one's focused significant pressure on the NGO sector yet. And as a result, there are a lot of them who are like sort of in the middle. They're sort of saying some things, but they're not really doing it very seriously.
And in the absence of any further questions, please join me in thanking Professors Duska, Winston, and Pierlot.
Thank you.